April 15, 1912, 2:20 a.m. The ocean is black, endless, merciless. The stars above are beautiful in a way that feels cruel, shining calmly while human lives are being torn apart below. The cold is not just cold, it is pain, cutting through skin, breath, and hope. In that dark water, 1,500 people are not just drowning, they are realizing the truth. Dreams are breaking, families are separating, love stories are ending, screams disappear into the night, lifeboats move away, half empty, carrying survival and guilt in the same silence. The ship that was called Unsinkable vanishes into the darkness, and with it sinks human arrogance, pride, and the illusion of control. This is not just a disaster. This is the moment humanity learned that nature does not care about power, money, or technology. It only cares about truth. And more than a century later, we are still haunted by it, because somewhere in that freezing water, we don't just see them, we see ourselves. To truly understand the horror of what happened on April 15, 1912, you first have to understand the extraordinary pride and ambition that created the Titanic in the first place. Because this ship was not just built, it was dreamed. It was willed into existence by men who believed that human ingenuity had no limits, that the ocean could be tamed, that engineering had finally conquered nature itself. And that belief, that magnificent, catastrophic, arrogant belief, is what killed 1,514 people. In the early 1900s, the shipping industry was the most powerful and competitive business in the world. Two British companies, the Cunard Line and the White Star Line, were locked in a war for dominance of the North Atlantic route between Europe and America. Cunard had just launched the Lusitania and the Mauretania, two of the fastest ships ever built, and passengers were flocking to them. The White Star Line, owned by J. Bruce Ismay and backed by the financial power of American banking titan J.P. Morgan, was falling behind. And men like Ismay do not fall behind quietly. So in 1907, Ismay sat down with William Peary, the chairman of the famous shipyard Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland, and together they sketched out a plan that would shake the world. They would not build the fastest ships. They would build the biggest, the most luxurious, the most magnificent. Ships so enormous, so breathtakingly opulent, so overwhelmingly impressive that no one would care about speed anymore. They would build floating cities, and the crown jewel of this fleet would be called the RMS Titanic. Construction began in 1909. Over 3,000 men worked on the Titanic at the Harland and Wolff shipyard, and their work was dangerous, brutal, and relentless. They worked with hammers and fire and molten steel rivets in the cold, wet Belfast air. During the 3 years of construction, 246 workers were injured, and 8 men died, the first victims of a ship that would take so many more. The Titanic was 882 feet long, nearly the length of 3 football fields. It weighed 46,000 tons. It had 9 decks, 840 staterooms, 4 giant funnels, and a grand staircase so beautiful it looked like it belonged in a European palace rather than on a ship. It took $7.5 million to build, the equivalent of over $200 million in today's money. When it was finally completed in the spring of 1912, it was the largest moving object ever created by human hands. And everyone, the engineers, the owners, the newspapers, the public, declared it unsinkable. That word, that one terrible, beautiful, devastating word. Unsinkable. The engineers said the Titanic's double bottom and 16 watertight compartments made it virtually impossible to sink. The ship could stay afloat even with 4 compartments flooded. It was, they said, as close to unsinkable as a ship could be. The press ran with it, the public believed it, and J. Bruce Ismay loved it. Because unsinkable was not just an engineering claim. It was a marketing strategy. It was a promise. And on April 10, 1912, when the Titanic set sail from Southampton, England on its maiden voyage to New York City, 2,224 people boarded that ship, trusting that promise with their lives. Here is a truth that the romantic version of the Titanic story often skips over. This was a ship built by class, run by class, and ultimately destroyed by class. Every single decision made on that ship, from the number of lifeboats to the placement of the decks, was made with money and social status in mind. And when the crisis came, those decisions determined who lived and who died with a cold, mathematical precision that should make every one of us furious. The first-class passengers on the Titanic did not simply buy a ticket, they bought a world. A first-class suite on the Titanic cost $4,350, which in today's money translates to nearly $100,000. For that price, you got a private promenade deck. You got a gymnasium, a heated swimming pool, a Turkish bath, a squash court, and a Parisian cafe. You got dining rooms with menus that offered up to 11 courses: oysters, consommé, salmon, filet mignon, roasted duck, foie gras, and desserts that could make a grown person weep. You got real silverware, real crystal, real art on the walls, and real mahogany furniture bolted to the floor so elegantly that you could forget you were at sea. The first-class lounge had a fireplace, on a ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. These people were not traveling. They were living in a palace that happened to float. Among the first-class passengers were some of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world. John Jacob Astor IV, worth an estimated $85 million, the equivalent of over $2 billion today, was traveling with his young pregnant wife, Madeline. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining empire, was on board. Isidore Straus, the co-owner of Macy's department store, was traveling with his wife, Ida. Molly Brown, the famous American socialite and activist, had a first-class cabin. These were the names that filled the newspapers. These were the faces of the Titanic. And then there was everyone else. 3 decks below the chandeliers and the champagne, in the lower levels of the ship, third-class passengers paid as little as $40 for a bunk in a shared cabin. $40 the equivalent of about $200 today. These were not wealthy tourists. These were people who had scraped and saved for years for this ticket. They were Irish farmers, Eastern European immigrants, Lebanese families, Scandinavian laborers, people who were leaving everything they had ever known for a chance at a new life in America. They carried their belongings in small trunks and suitcases. They shared bathrooms, they ate simple food in crowded dining halls, and they were physically separated from the upper decks by locked gates. Gates that, on the night the ship sank, would become a death sentence for hundreds of them. The survival statistics tell the story more clearly than any words can. Of the first-class passengers, 62% survived. Of the second-class passengers, 41% survived. Of the third-class passengers, those immigrants, those dreamers, those people who had given everything for a $40 ticket to a better life, only 25% survived. And of the third-class children, more than half of them died. On the same ship, in the same ocean, under the same stars. When the insurance claim was finally settled, the White Star Line received $5 million, just over half of what the ship actually cost to build. The owners were compensated, at least partially. The 1,514 people who died received nothing but a number in a newspaper. You tell me who really paid the price. This story that most people think they know. The iceberg, the sinking, the lifeboats. But the truth of what happened that night is so much more horrifying, so much more infuriating, so much more heartbreaking than anything Hollywood has ever shown you. Because what happened on April 14th and 15th, 1912, was not just a tragic accident. It was a catastrophe made entirely by human decisions. Every single choice made in the hours, days, and years before that iceberg appeared could have prevented it. And none of them were made correctly. Let us start with the warnings. On April 14th, 1912, the day the Titanic hit the iceberg, the ship received not 1, not 2, but 6 separate iceberg warnings from other ships in the area. 6. The waters ahead were known to be dangerous. Other captains had already seen ice. The messages were clear, urgent, and impossible to misunderstand. One message from the ship SS Mesaba described a massive field of ice directly in the Titanic's path. That message never even reached the bridge. Why? Because the Titanic's wireless operators were too busy sending personal messages for wealthy first-class passengers, social telegrams, stock market updates, dinner party announcements, to prioritize a safety warning. The one operator who tried to relay a warning from another ship was cut off mid-transmission by the Titanic's own wireless operator, who snapped at him to get off the line. Captain Edward John Smith, a 62-year-old veteran of the seas who was on his retirement voyage, knew about the ice. He had received warnings. And yet, at the instruction of J. Bruce Ismay, the ship's owner, who was on board and who very much wanted to arrive in New York early and generate maximum publicity, the Titanic maintained a speed of 22 knots, nearly full speed, through waters that every experienced sailor in the area was treating with extreme caution. Because arriving a day early would make headlines. Because a record crossing would sell tickets for future voyages. Because the dream of triumph mattered more than the responsibility of safety. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted the iceberg and immediately rang the bell and called the bridge. The officer on watch ordered the ship to turn and the engines to reverse. But at 22 knots, a ship the size of the Titanic cannot stop or turn quickly enough. They had approximately 37 seconds from the moment the iceberg was spotted to the moment of impact. It was not enough. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship for about 10 seconds, and in those 10 seconds, it opened wounds in the hull across 6 separate compartments. The Titanic could survive 4 flooded compartments. 6 was a death sentence. Thomas Andrews, the ship's chief designer, the man who knew her better than anyone, went below to inspect the damage immediately. He came back to the bridge with a calm face and a devastating calculation. The ship had, at most, 2 hours before it sank. He knew it. Captain Smith knew it. Ismay knew it. And for the next 40 minutes, while passengers were still sleeping soundly in their cabins, the people in charge tried to figure out what to do next. 40 minutes. That was time that could have been used to wake passengers, to organize evacuation, to properly load lifeboats. Instead, it was spent in shock, in denial, and in an almost incomprehensible failure of leadership. And then there were the lifeboats. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Those 20 lifeboats had a total capacity of 1,178 people. The ship was carrying 2,224, do the mathematics. Even if every single lifeboat was filled to absolute maximum capacity, more than 1,000 people were going to die regardless. But here is the part that makes it so much worse. The lifeboats were not filled to capacity, not even close. In the chaos and confusion of the evacuation, officers were so worried about the boats breaking apart if overloaded that they sent them into the water half empty. Lifeboat number 1 had a capacity of 40 people. It left with 12. While 1,500 people were standing on a sinking ship, a lifeboat designed for 40 carried 12 people to safety and rowed away. And why were there only 20 lifeboats in the first place? Because the original design had called for 48, which would have been enough for everyone on board. But 48 lifeboats were deemed too cluttered, too ugly, too disruptive to the clean, elegant lines of the ship's deck. Appearances. They chose appearances over the lives of more than 1,000 human beings. When people realized what was happening, the panic was unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. The ship's lights flickered and buzzed as the generators struggled. The bow was sinking deeper and deeper into the black water, and the stern was rising higher and higher into the air. People were sliding down the deck. Furniture was breaking free and crashing. At one point, the ship groaned so loudly it could be heard for miles across the water. A sound that survivors described as nothing human, nothing natural, a sound from the deep earth itself. And then at approximately 2:18 a.m., the Titanic broke in half. The forward section tore away and plunged to the ocean floor at approximately 35 miles per hour. The stern section, still filled with hundreds of people, shot upward nearly vertical, hung there for a moment, one terrible, eternal moment, and then followed its sister into the deep. The water temperature was -2 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, a healthy adult human being loses muscle control within minutes. The heart can go into shock almost immediately. Most people in that water were dead within 15 to 30 minutes. 2,500 people hit that water. Oh, they screamed. Survivors in the lifeboats, floating in the darkness just hundreds of yards away, heard it all. That sound, 2,500 human voices crying out in the freezing dark, is described in survivor testimony after survivor testimony as the most unbearable thing any of them ever experienced. One survivor said she could still hear it 30 years later, in the quiet of the night, when the world went still. And then, slowly, horribly, the screaming faded. Not because rescue came, because the people stopped being able to scream. Because the cold took them one by one, and the ocean became quiet again. That silence, every survivor agreed, was worse than the screaming. There are stories from that night that history has recorded. Individual stories, human stories. And they are the ones that remind you that the Titanic was not a statistic. It was 2,224 people, each with a face and a name and a life and someone who loved them. Isidore Straus was 67 years old, the co-owner of Macy's, one of the wealthiest men in America. His wife Ida was 63. When the evacuation began, Isidore helped Ida toward a lifeboat. She got to the edge, looked at the boat, looked at her husband, and then stepped back. She could not leave him. She would not leave him. She reportedly said, "We have lived together so long. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs, holding hands, as the water rose around them. They went into the ocean together. Neither survived. Their story is one of the most quietly devastating love stories in human history. Not because it is romantic, but because it is true. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune, was traveling with his valet and his personal secretary. When it became clear that the ship was going to sink, Guggenheim went back to his cabin and changed into his finest evening clothes. His tuxedo, his white tie, his best shoes. He came back up to the deck immaculate, composed, holding a glass of brandy. He reportedly said, "We have dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He sent a message to his wife back home. "No woman shall be left aboard this ship because Ben Guggenheim was a coward. He did not survive. He went down with the ship exactly as he promised, dressed in his finest, refusing to take a seat that might have belonged to a woman or a child. And then there were the musicians. Wallace Hartley and his 7 bandmates. They were hired entertainers, not heroes. They were not military men, not officers, not trained for disaster. They were musicians. When the evacuation began, they gathered on the deck with their instruments and they played. Waltz's hymns, upbeat songs to keep the crowd calm and moving. They played for over 2 hours while the ship sank beneath their feet. Passengers who later described the scene said that the music was the only thing that kept them from complete panic. That the sound of those instruments floating across the dark water made the nightmare feel somehow survivable. Not one of the 8 musicians made it into a lifeboat. Not one of them survived. Wallace Hartley's violin was later found strapped to his body when it was recovered from the ocean. It sold at auction in 2013 for $1.7 million. But what it was worth in courage that night cannot be calculated by any human measure. And the mothers, God, the mothers. Women standing at the railing of lifeboats, holding their children over the edge, lowering them down with their own arms into the hands of strangers below, because the rule was women and children first. But the reality was that not all women and children could go, and not all women were willing to leave without their husbands. Some women refused to go and stayed behind with their husbands, choosing death together over survival alone. Some women were put on lifeboats by force, screaming and reaching back toward the men they were leaving behind. Some mothers put their children in lifeboats and then could not get in themselves as the boats were lowered, and stood on the deck watching the small faces of their children disappear into the darkness below. Those children arrived in New York as orphans. They were met at the dock by strangers, and for the rest of their lives, some of them never fully understood what had happened on that cold April night, only that their mother had lifted them into a boat and smiled and said she would be right behind them, and she never came. The Titanic has been at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean for over 110 years. The wreck was discovered in 1985, 2 miles below the surface, broken in 2 pieces exactly where the survivors said it broke. Scientists and historians and filmmakers have studied every inch of it. And still, the questions remain. Still, the answers are incomplete. Still, the injustice burns. Why did Captain Smith ignore 6 iceberg warnings? Was it pressure from Ismay? Was it his own pride on his final voyage? Was it simple human overconfidence in a ship that everyone around him kept calling unsinkable? We will never fully know, because Smith went down with his ship and took his reasoning with him to the bottom of the ocean. Why did the lifeboats leave half empty? Why did officers not fill them? Why did none of the half-empty lifeboats go back to rescue the people screaming in the water? There were survivors who later testified that they begged the people rowing the boats to turn around and go back. They were told no. The people in charge of those boats were afraid of being swamped, afraid of the desperate hands of drowning people grabbing at the sides and capsizing everything. Fear drove those decisions. Reasonable fear, perhaps? But the result was that people who could have been saved were left to die in freezing water while half-empty lifeboats floated 50 yards away. And then there is J. Bruce Ismay, the owner of the ship, the man who pushed for speed, who loved the idea of a record crossing, who had the power to order more lifeboats and more caution and more preparation. Ismay got into a lifeboat. As the ship was sinking, as over 2,500 people were crowding the deck, as women and children were being separated from their families forever, J. Bruce Ismay stepped into collapsible lifeboat C and rowed away from the ship he owned. He did not look back. He reportedly sat with his back to the Titanic so he would not have to watch it sink. He survived. He returned to England. He resigned from White Star Line. He lived in near seclusion for the rest of his life, rarely appearing in public, haunted, some said, by what he had done and what he had failed to do. He died in 1937, alone with whatever he knew about that night. History has judged him harshly. Perhaps too harshly to satisfy the truth, and perhaps not harshly enough. The most haunting question of all, though, is this one. What if they had turned around? What if just one of those lifeboats had gone back into the screaming darkness and started pulling people out of the water? Lifeboat 14, under the command of Officer Harold Lowe, did eventually go back, but only after waiting nearly an hour for the screaming to die down, afraid of being overwhelmed. By the time Lowe returned, most of the people in the water were already dead from hypothermia. He pulled out 4 survivors. 4. If even half of the other lifeboats had gone back immediately, historians estimate that hundreds more people could have been saved. Hundreds. People who could have lived. People who chose to go down fighting, who held on and treaded water and screamed for help, who were already in reach of those wooden boats but never heard an oar splash toward them. They died waiting for help that was floating right there in the dark, 20 yards away, and chose not to come. When the RMS Carpathia arrived at the scene at approximately 4:10 a.m., an hour and 50 minutes after the Titanic sank. It found lifeboats scattered across the water and bodies floating in life jackets, perfectly preserved by the cold, their faces turned upward toward the stars. The Carpathia's crew and passengers worked for hours pulling survivors out of the lifeboats, wrapping them in blankets, giving them hot drinks, holding them while they shook. 710 survivors came aboard, and then the Carpathia turned and sailed for New York because there was nothing left to do at the site of the Titanic. The ocean had taken everything else. When the Carpathia docked in New York on the night of April 18th, over 40,000 people were waiting at the pier. The news had already spread across the world via telegraph. Newspapers were carrying the story on every front page, in every language, on every continent. The shock was total and absolute. This was not supposed to happen. The unsinkable ship had sunk. The greatest engineering triumph of the age lay at the bottom of the Atlantic, and 14 people were dead. The investigations that followed, both in America and in Britain, revealed the full extent of the failures that had led to the disaster. New maritime laws were passed. From that point forward, ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for every passenger on board. Radio operators were required to remain on duty 24 hours a day. International Ice Patrol was established in the North Atlantic, and it operates to this day, monitoring iceberg positions and warning ships of danger. The International Ice Patrol has been operating continuously since 1914, and in all the decades since, not a single ship following its warnings has been lost to ice. The Titanic's death, in a very real sense, is the reason that story has never been repeated. But the 14 people who died paid for those lessons with their lives. And no law, no patrol, no regulation, no memorial, no museum, no film, no matter how beautiful or how heartbreaking, can give them back. The Titanic was not just a ship. Say it with me, it was not just a ship. It was a mirror, a perfect, terrible mirror held up to the face of civilization at the height of its confidence and its arrogance and its inequality. It showed us who we truly were in the moments that matter most, not who we pretended to be in the daylight, not who we appeared to be in our fine clothes and expensive cabins, but who we were when the water was rising and the choices were real and the consequences were final. It showed us cowardice in the men who rushed past women and children to grab seats in lifeboats. It showed us the absolute crushing weight of class inequality in the locked gates that kept third-class passengers below while first-class passengers had direct access to the boat deck. It showed us the stunning failure of leadership in the men who received 6 warnings and kept going, in the men who built a ship with lifeboats for half its passengers, in the man who owned the ship and saved himself while his passengers drowned. But it also showed us something else, something that matters just as much, maybe more. It showed us the band playing until the water reached their feet. It showed us Isidore and Ida Strauss choosing to die together rather than be separated. It showed us Benjamin Guggenheim dressing in his finest clothes and going down like a gentleman because he refused to be a coward. It showed us the fathers lifting their children over their heads to get them into lifeboats they could not follow them into. It showed us the strangers who held strangers' hands in the dark water and said it was going to be okay, even when it wasn't. Even when they both knew it wasn't, because that is what human beings sometimes do for each other when everything else has been stripped away. The ocean didn't sink the Titanic, human arrogance did, and 14 people paid for that arrogance with everything they had. But in the way they faced it, in the music and the love and the courage and the sacrifice, they gave us something extraordinary. They gave us a story that refuses to be forgotten. They gave us a mirror that we are still, more than 100 years later, not brave enough to look away from. Because somewhere in that story is the truth about all of us, about who we are when we are at our worst, and who we can be when we are at our best, about what we choose when the choice is real, and the night is dark and the water is rising. The Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. We are still going down with it.